Hi, I'm Anna, and this is Bookspotting. I've been away for a little bit, just different things, haven't been able to do it, but I'm hoping to get back into the BookTube community by doing this tag that I was actually tagged on, or tagged in, by Wilsonn Shugart. I think that's his name. And the original tag was devised by Jason from Old Blues Chapter and Verse. And the tag is called the Top Tens tag. And so the idea is that you come up with some books like this, and you pick your favorite 10 books that you've ever read that have been the most influential, the ones you just most liked, and it can be nonfiction and fiction on all sorts of things in between. And you rank them. So number 1 is the one that you most like, etc. So I came up with 10 plus a couple of extra. We'll see if I have time to get to them. So I'm going to go in reverse order. So beginning from number 10, and seeing as my channel is called Bookspotting, I don't know if it's such a surprise that number 10 would be Trainspotting. So I read this, I think pretty soon after the book came out. No, I tell a lie. It was maybe when the movie came out. I'm not really sure anymore. Point is, I read this a long time ago and I just fell for it. I mean, at first it was strange read because it's full of slang, and not only that, but it is full on Scottish accent, but in a written form, and being, speaking American English, and it was just a whole new world. So it did take me probably a couple of days to get used to the writing, to the dialogue, to try and figure out what the hell was going on. But once I got into it, I just completely fell in love with this crazy world of drug taking in Edinburgh, which was a million miles away, both geographically and in every other way, from my own very placid, straight edge kind of person that I was and still am. And so this is number 10, Trainspotting by Irvine Welsh. Moving on to my number 9 favorite book, and we're going all the way back to my adolescence, and it is The Hero and the Crown by Robin McKinley. And I still remember buying this book. I think I bought it through either Scholastic or Troll. For those that aren't familiar, in the US, when you're in primary school, which is up until you're about 14 or so, once every, 3 months or so, we would have these little sheets, these little mini catalogs of books from these two companies, Troll and from Scholastic, and you could just tick off the books that you would want to order, and then you bring in the cash to your teacher, and then, a few weeks later, the books would be delivered to the classroom, and you'd get your books. And for me, being in a book desert that I lived in until I went to college in New Jersey, this was a godsend, being able to actually have access to new books that I would get to keep. And this book was tremendous because I think it was the first book that I read that had a female hero. I always styled myself as the hero whenever I would read medieval stories or anything to do with dragons or knights, but this was the first book that I read that actually had a female hero. I didn't have to imagine myself in that. It was like, oh, it's a girl just like me. And plus, even though it was for children, it dealt, I remember having sort of like a sensual, sexy scene in there that was not too risque for my early teens. And so yeah, I loved this book so much. And moving on to number 8, Dead Men Do Tell Tales. And I read this back in high school when I was trying to figure out what to do with my life and where to go and study and what to study. And this was one of the books that kind of reaffirmed my wanting to go into anthropology, which is what I studied in school. And this is a great book by Dr. William Maples with the help of Michael Browning, it looks like. And it's all about the dead body farm which if some of you don't know about it, is a farm in the United States where forensic pathologists and scientists will take bodies that have been donated to science, and they will leave them in different settings to decompose. So then by studying that, they can then later on help out in criminal cases, and it's a tremendous thing. And I mean, I well remember trying to talk about this book during lunchtime when I was in high school to my friends who were probably just horrified that I would talk about this kind of stuff, involving maggots and such. I didn't actually end up studying this particular branch of anthropology because I like reading about it, but in reality a bit too squeamish for this sort of thing. But I love this book, and it was very influential. Moving on to number 7. Now this is basically an illustration. It's not perhaps literally my favorite book, but I had to pick one that kind of stood for all of these books. And this is Uncle Scrooge, Only a Poor Old Man by Carl Banks. And Disney comics were tremendously influential in my life. It was how I first learned how to read. We always had Disney comic books laying around, and they were full of adventures, not like the Disney cartoons of Mickey Mouse being, silly and all that. No, Mickey would go on tremendous adventures, as well as Uncle Scrooge and Donald Duck. And this is how I learned geography. This is how I learned history. Until I was in high school. It was through the pages. I mean, these amazing pages, full color. I mean, granted, the copies that I had would be the old-fashioned little comic books, but this is like a wonderful new version of it. And these were amazing, and they were such an important part of my childhood. And now moving on to the first Portuguese book in the collection here. And it is, excuse me, just have to turn my phone back on for my timer so I don't lose track of time. And it is O Crime do Padre Amaru by Essa de Queiroz, or The Crime of Father Amaru. And it is a 19th century novel. And it was really important for me, and it's been made into a film, and you might recognize Gael Garcia Bernal, who was in the adaptation. They did a slightly modern adaptation. And this book was the first book that made me realize, oh wait, Portuguese literature has writers, going way back that were just as important as Charles Dickens. It's just that, the wider world doesn't really know about them so much. So Essa de Queiroz was pretty much, I think of him as the Dickens of Portugal. He wrote about, everyday life and the social strata. And I mean, they're talking about, not to give anything away too much, but they're talking about abortion in this book in the 19th century. So tremendous book, highly recommended. Now the number 5 book is Frida, a biography of Frida Kahlo, and I cannot say how much I loved this book. This book was eye-opening and was such a treasure when I found it. I read it when I was still in high school, I think, and it opened up my eyes to what an artist could be. She was disabled. She didn't have a tremendous education, but mostly it was the disability and the fact that she also was a woman, and yet she did so much with her time and her talent, and it was just completely fell in love with it. And just love Frida. And moving on to number 4, Tale of Two Cities, which is, I have like a little rinky-dinky copy of it. This is not actually the copy that I used to read when I first read it, but it's a copy that I found later on, and I just kind of fell in love with it. It's just a lovely little copy. And this is my favorite of the Dickens books. It has so much. It has romance and adventure and tragedy and sacrifice. And it was around the time when I read it that PBS aired the British, I think the BBC adaptation of Tale of Two Cities, and that made it even more special. And this book also holds another special place in my heart, because it was, I think, partly because of this book that I actually was accepted into a university when I applied. My acceptance letter directly mentioned me having talked about this in my application, apparently. So yeah, I love this book. And now number 3 is Catch-22 by Joseph Heller. And this is my husband's copy. And this is the copy that I actually carried around when I was reading it, which is completely falling apart. I found it somewhere in some thrift store or something. They probably should have paid me to take it, because it was just really falling apart. I've had to, even now, even as I'm speaking, the book is starting to fall more apart. But I can't help it. I've just held on to it, even though we have a nice, copy of it. And this book was just, it changed my philosophy of life. Just what I believed in and what I didn't believe in. It just kind of reaffirmed some of the way that my belief system was heading to, and it kind of reinforced it. And it's also just a tremendous book to read if you have any interest in what it's like to be in a war setting. It's just really amazing. And sorry if things look a little bit different. I had a little problem with the camera, but let's keep on. So going on to number 2, which is the José Saramago, well, no, that's the author, Memorial do Convento, or otherwise known in English as Baltasar and Blimunda. I personally prefer this title here, but I understand why they changed it to this, because it was a bit, I guess, esoteric. Memorial of the Convent, which is what it translates to. And this is just a tremendous, amazing book. Excuse me. It is set in the early 1700s in Portugal during the construction of the convent of Mafra, which was a promise made by Dom João V, I believe, to God, that if his wife should deliver their child healthily, and she should be healthy as well, that he would build this amazing testament to the wonder of God just outside of Lisbon in Mafra. And so this deals with the Inquisition, with auto de fe, which are when people would be burnt at the stake. It deals with the Jews being kicked out of Portugal. It deals with the first experiments of flights, where there were some Portuguese priests that started to experiment and actually had some liftoff, and with witchcraft, or rather women being accused of being witches. And it's a magical book, and at the heart of it is Baltasar and Blimunda, and it's their love story amidst the craziness of this. It also deals with transportation, because much like they had in the UK, criminals being transported to Australia, in Portugal they would be transported to the African colonies like Angola. So it's a beautiful book. I don't know if this is a good translation, because I've only ever read it in the original Portuguese. I know typeset wise, I don't really like these margins. I don't particularly like this version. Just not enough space. You can't like rest your eyes. But I love Saramago, so can't recommend that highly enough. And then number 1 has to be Jane Eyre. What little girl, who likes to read doesn't have Jane Eyre in her heart? This was an amazing book. A young woman, a young heroine who doesn't compromise, who is always herself, who knows her own worth, and it's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful, beautiful book. So that's my number 1. And then I said that I would talk about a couple of just honorable mentions, and one of them is High Fidelity by Nick Hornby. This is pretty much a male version of what I was like in my early 20s or so, kind of misanthropic, and I mean, it's a bit shallow, but that's what I was like, possibly in my 20s. And yeah, it's just a great, funny, fun book. And then very quickly, 'cause I'm running out of time, Griffin and Sabine. It's a collection by Nick Bancott, Sabine's Notebook, The Golden Mean, The Griffin, and all of these are great books, and they're all interactive. They imagine correspondence between a real person and a fake person, and you've got all these like nice little letters you take out, and it's just beautiful, beautiful stuff. And then finally, I couldn't not mention Calvin and Hobbes. Any one of the collections really is good, but I just picked this one, just, you know, out of a hat. It's a Magical World by Bill Watterson, and the wonder and the whimsy and the imagination of these, and being able to read them, you know, every Sunday in the comics and then collecting them, it was just fantastic. Anyway, so that's my top 10 tags. Thanks again to Wilsonn Shugart for having nominated me and or tagged me, and thanks for Jason from Old Blues for having come up with a tag to begin with. And so I'm Anna, and this is Bookspotting, and I hope to see you again very soon. Bye.